Shabbat Shalom, and welcome once again to BLT, Bagels, Love, and Torah. I am, as always, Rabbi Philip Rice. They call me Rabbi Flip. And I'm coming to you virtually as we continue to immerse ourselves in words of Torah from the community of Congregation Micah. And as always, missing you in person and hoping we can be together soon. So in the short run, I welcome you here. I hope you grab a bagel or something to eat, and maybe a copy of the text will be in Parashat Devarim. It's pretty easy to find. It's the 5th book of the Torah, and we're going to start in the first chapter of that book. Devarim, things, matters, words. In general, we like to begin with a blessing, and so we say Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. We thank that power in the universe that commands us to spend a little time busying ourselves with the sacred, with Scripture, with the text, and all text transmissions of an insightful nature become Torah to me, and you know I'm in love with Rabbi Wolpe's short little teachings from his book, Floating Takes Faith, and here I share with you mountains and microchips. In Psalm 27, Psalm 20, verse 7, we read, "They call on chariots and call on horses, but we call on the name of the Lord our God." So let's consider updating the psalm. Instead of reading it as a psalm about war, let's think about it as a psalm of daily life. And chariots represent technology, and horses represent nature. In our lives, we rely on one or the other. Some revel in the wonders of technology. I mean, just how we're doing this now. Our data proliferate as our handled computers shrink in size. Whether our faith lies in chariots or microchips or any other products of the human hand, it's the same. Others worship nature, neglecting the less savory side of the terrestrial world. They deem everything natural as wonderful, that so much human beneficence consists in escaping nature, building houses, heating and cooling them, taking antibiotics, escapes attention. There is wonder in technology, and there is significance in nature. We cannot live without either one. But to trust either one is also foolish. Thousands of years ago, the psalmist left us this advice: both nature and technology are imperfect. Rely on them only so far. We who appreciate both seek also to transcend both. We call on the name of the Lord our God. All of this by way of introduction to warm up our brains and our thinking so that we can engage in that sacred text. And we'll do that in a moment. Parashat Devarim. It sort of begins with a series of speeches by Moses to the Israelites. They are about to enter the Holy Land of Israel, and Moses is going to die in Moab on Mount Nebo. And so he reminds the people that they will take possession of the land, the one that was given to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah. He recalls a time when he was unable to lead them by himself and had to rely on God, and that it was God who helped, told him really to also appoint wise leaders to assist him. Moses also recounts sending scouts into the land to explore it, and the divisive report that comes back that frightened the people about their ability to defeat the current inhabitants. And because of the scouts' perspective and the people's lack of faith, their whole generation is now not allowed to enter the land. Only Caleb and Joshua, son of Nun, if you recall, bring back a positive report, and they will be the new leaders of the next generation who will lead them into the land. Moses then recounts the route of travel. He goes from places called Kadesh Barnea, southward to Ezon Geber, then northward skirting Edom and Moab to Kedemoth and Heshbon, and finally mentions the victorious battles with Sihon, king of Heshbon, and Og, king of Bashan. But the portion is chock full of some powerful wisdom and also some interesting, I'll call it theology. That's what it is. It's a certain view of the universe, and it's both healthy and unhealthy, to tell you the truth. So, if you recall, there are two tribes, Reuven and Gad, who remind Moses that they had agreed to permit them to remain east of the Jordan. And unlike the rest of Israel, their God-given inheritance was to be sort of on the east side, like East Nashville. Before we enter the land, God speaks to us at the mountain of Horeb, and God says, basically, enough dwelling here at the mountain, right? Turn yourself around and journey. Deuteronomy verses 6 and 7 is where this is being conveyed. This mountain is Sinai, though. This is the place of revelation. The giving, the receiving of Torah. I mean, can we ever have enough of Sinai? So it seems. We can. The Israelites lived in proximity of Mount Sinai for a long time. And when God told them to move on, you can imagine there was some hesitation. This was a sacred mountain. It was a holy place. It was the phone booth, so of talking to the divine. And why would you want to leave? And yet leave is what they must do. Leave taking. It's what being Jewish is largely about. God told Avram, Lech Lecha, leave your ancestral home, free yourself of all you've inherited from your parents, your tribe, your culture, journey to the unknown. Jacob met God on a journey after he left home. God accompanies the people wherever they wander is part of the Torah's message. Sitting still seems a little antithetical to God's design. Even when the people settle eventually, right, in the promised land, they are to journey to Jerusalem 3 times each year, according to our tradition. I don't think God wants us to get too comfortable. We're always urged to get up, move, but not just move. We're told to turn ourselves around and journey. It's turning ourselves around that makes the journey sacred. It's turning ourselves around that makes journeying a spiritual request. What does it mean to turn ourselves around? To turn around when we are camped at Sinai could mean to turn our backs on Sinai. But maybe that's understood in a couple of different ways. On the one hand, it can mean that we're to forget the Sinai experience. But on the other hand, it means that we are to take what we can from it and return to the world. It is the second interpretation, as you can imagine, that I find more powerful. Indeed, the Hebrew text can be read not simply as enough of this dwelling by the mountain, but you have gained an abundance from dwelling at Sinai. Rav, like Rabbi, Rav, enough, abundance, much, many. Yeah, we're supposed to have much knowledge, but I rely on the knowledge of our ancestors. The goal of Judaism is apparently not revelation. It's transformation. It's not enough that we get to the place of God. We have to move on to a place where we can manifest godliness. This is what Judaism asks of us. Turn ourselves around and journey. Turning ourselves around could also mean to turn inward, to find the truth that is our very being and to take that truth out into the world. Because we can and we should learn from Sinai, from the teachers and the teachings outside the self. But in the end, it is turning around, connecting with the inner truth that really both sets us and keeps us on our journey. It is the nature of external teachers and teachings, parents and spouses in the world, to keep us close to the mountain, because the mountain is fixed. It can be fenced. It feels safe. It feels controlled. But life and spirituality are not fixed. They are not fenced, they are not safe, and they are not controlled. Life and spirituality, they are wild and radically free. And it's the nature of Judaism to push us past the mountain to the promised land. Of course, the land too can be cultivated and fenced, and we must be extra careful not to allow it, never mistaking the land for lines in the sand. But the Torah is telling us in this parasha, Devarim, that spiritual work is not about arriving, it's about journeying. It's not about the last step, it's about the next step. And we are challenged here to take stock of what we have learned so far in life and to turn around and take what we can and leave behind so that we can continue on our journey. Journeying itself is the way. Arriving is only temporary. So we're going to move on, delve a little deeper into actual text. So it's probably cliche to say that we shouldn't be judgmental, that religious people especially to try not to judge others, and I do my best. But the truth is that judging is part of being human, and all things are not the same to us, and they shouldn't be. And so there is right and there is wrong, and we have to be able to judge between them. And I think what our Torah portion is about to teach us here is that there's a right way to judge and there's a wrong way to judge. And so let's hear from the Torah itself. Baruch hu et Adonai hamivorach. Baruch Adonai mevorach le'olam va'ed. Baruch ata Adonai Eloheinu melech ha'olam. Asher bachar banu mikol ha'amim v'natan lanu et Torato. Baruch ata Adonai noten ha'torah. So it says, Va'etzaveh et shoftechem. It's and I will charge, I guess, or command, mitzaveh, your judges, ba'et hahi, at that time, lemor, saying, shamoa. This is interesting. Hear, listen, bein achechem, between your brothers, your fellows, ushaftem tzedek, and decide with tzedek, with justice or righteousness, right? Tzedek, tirdo for tzedakah. Bein ish uvein achiv, between a man and between his brother or his fellow. Uvein gero, and between even a stranger. Lo takiru panim b'mishpat. You cannot, this is a good way to translate it, you can't be partial to the face of one in this judgment. Katon kagadol. So you have to tishma'un lo. You have to listen to the small and the big alike, right? So it's sort of like you hear them out, whether it's a low person or a high person, it doesn't matter. Lo taguru mipnei ish. Fear no person. Ki hamishpat lalachechem hi, because judgment is God's. V'hadavar hazeh, Devarim is the name of our portion, and v'hadavar, and this matter, asher yikshne mikem, that I am finding difficult, maybe would be a good way to translate it. Tak rivun alai, bring it to me. This is God talking. Ushmativ, and I will hear it. I'm going to stop there and say, Baruch ata Adonai Eloheinu melech ha'olam asher natan lanu Torah temet v'chayei olam nata b'tochenu. Baruch ata Adonai noten ha'torah. All right, maybe I'll give you a little text in a translation, not my own, that will flow a little better. It says, and I instructed the judges at that time, saying, listen to every dispute between your brothers and judge righteously between a man and his fellow and the stranger that is with him. Do not give anyone special consideration when making judgment. Listen to the great and to the small alike. Do not fear the face of anyone, for judgment is God's. So this is Deuteronomy, first chapter, verses 16 and 17, if you want to pull it and take a look. Here are my questions, right? We're going to do our little pardes thing again. Why does Torah say you shall listen? Right? If they don't listen, how can they judge? Torah really means to say that they should listen to the whole case without interruption or postponement or bias. Torah prohibits lengthy trials and demands swift justice. This is the commentary of Or HaChaim. He continues, a certain pious judge, Rabbi Moshe Berdugo, would avert his gaze from both parties so as to simply hear what was being said and not be swayed by anything but the words themselves. Interesting. All right. Peshat, paradise. Here we go. We're going to get there. It's like the promised land. The simple meaning, Pshat. The simple meaning, paradise. At this level, Torah is speaking only to judges, actually. Those officially chosen to decide legal matters among the Israelites. His concern for impartiality lifts Torah to the highest ethical standard. His concern, in those days, his concern was about judgment, and then it went only towards the wealthy against the poor and the alien, as opposed to now where judgment goes towards, never mind. Remez, always a clue in paradise, the R, the resh sound. There's a clue. Rabbi Berdugo took the passage literally and averted his eyes from the litigants. Why did he do this, right? When you really need to listen, don't you often close your eyes? Right? How might this play out in our everyday lives? Where are you called upon to judge between people? And do you focus on the force of their arguments and the facts of their case? Or are you swayed sort of by the external matters? Okay, we got a drash. We got an interpretive reading on the way to paradise, the Dalet. Why does Torah emphasize between? Could it be that there is no argument except in the space between people? And what is that space? How essential is it to your life? Does the between separate one person from another, or does it link one person to another? Are we ever really alone? And finally, the Sod, the secret meeting in paradise. The stranger is the key to this level of the text, right? We have a natural fear of the stranger, of the unknown. And we like everything to fit into patterns set down in the past. So Torah is saying, do not prejudice the unknown. Spiritual practice takes us beyond the known into the unknown and the unknowable. God is the unknown and the unknowable. How do you prejudge God? God is this, God is that. This is prejudging. What would it mean for you to enter the unknown that is between things without judging? Just being, just encountering. A student once said to Rabbi Yerachimel, each one of us on a journey towards God, just as father keeps his distance from his child in order to teach her to walk, so God keeps stepping back as I move forward. That said the Rebbe, and plopped himself down on the ground. Why is the master sitting? And the student asked, oh, because I've already arrived. Well, I don't know if that got us to the promised land, but we thank Rabbi Rami Shapiro, as always, for giving us a mystical interpretation of a powerful text. We're going to look at Devar Acher and maybe drill down on a few other little texts in a moment. This drash, this interpretation, comes by way of Rabbi Ken Chasen, senior rabbi of Leo Beck Temple in Los Angeles, California, who is looking at Deuteronomy chapter 1, verses 26 and 27, which read, "Yet you refused to go up and flouted the command of the Eternal your God. You sulked in your tents and said, 'It is because the Eternal hates us that God brought us out of the land of Egypt.'" So he writes, I spent most of my childhood wanting to grow up as quickly as possible. In the race to independence, my older brother was always 3 years ahead of me. When we were little, I resented his later bedtime. As we grew, his later curfew. It seems especially unjust. I felt like I would be a child forever. Well, my frustration frequently tumbled out of me in anger that was directed at my parents. I rallied against their hypocrisies, picked at their emotional vulnerabilities, and demanded respect and freedom. For a while, it seemed that the most prominent sound in our house was the noise of doors slamming. My rage bewildered my parents. Usually, they couldn't even see it coming. And what intensified my rebellion? The very actions they took with hopes of granting me a better future. The more they, quote, loved me by establishing expectations, the more deliberately I rejected those expectations, determined to prove myself a worthy adversary. Back then, I felt that my oppression was somehow unique to my family. However, now that I have a teenage son of my own, I have come to regard the sometimes violent push and pull of adolescence as something necessary, common, painful, and yet strangely holy. Perhaps that is why the Torah actually sanctifies this kind of rebellion, through the relationship between God, the parent, and the adolescent Israelites. In Devarim, Moses addresses the Israelites as they prepare, at last, to enter the Promised Land. He opens with a reminder of how things were once between God and the Israelites, back when, things were, easier, when the relationship was young. The people embraced God, the parent. Promises were made and kept. The people grew in number. They consented to the plans that were laid out for them. But then, Moses recalls, as the Israelites grew in their bond with God, the story became more complicated. God's endless rules became irritating to them. And the final straw came when God told them that it was time to enter the Promised Land. They simply weren't interested in doing as they were told. They had plans of their own. Moses' description of what comes next reminds me of my childhood home. Yet you refused to go up and flouted the command of the Eternal your God. You sulked in your tents and said, it is because the Eternal hates us that he brought us out of the land of Egypt. This is from Deuteronomy, right? 26 and 7 verses chapter 1. If those tents had been, fitted with doors, there would surely have been slamming. God the parent hates our ancestors, the children of Israel. The defense that follows sounds familiar to anyone who has ever accused his or her parent of hatred. You saw how the Eternal your God carried you as a man carry his son. Yet for all that, you have no faith. That's a little further in verses 31 and 32. Nowadays, when tensions in my house rise, I sometimes find myself lingering in sweet memories of how it used to be, back when my teenage son was a small boy and I carried him in my arms. But I know that it can't stay that way. I don't even want it to stay that way. The rebellion must happen. Ultimately, it enabled the Israelites to grow up and to discover a new trust in their parent and to follow their own path into the Promised Land. It'll enable my son to do the same. The medieval Jewish sage Chasdai Ibn Kreskas taught, at 5, your child is your master. At 10, your servant. At 15, your double. And after that, your friend or foe, depending upon his or her upbringing. Growing up's a wild ride. We don't get to stay for very long at any stop along the way. So because we can't be sure that we won't, in fact, be children forever, our best way is simply to trust that the necessary, common, painful, and yet strangely holy journey leads us to the Promised Land. Stay tuned for Devarach here. I found a good drash given the sort of state of dialogue in our country. It's called Angry at God. It's by my teacher, Rabbi Harold Kushner. Thereupon I said to you, I cannot bear the burden of you by myself. It's Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 9. When the curtain goes up on the book of Deuteronomy, Moses is an old man. By the Torah's reckoning, he has reached the age of 120. And in this portion and in those that follow, he seems to show the cumulative effect of having worn himself out in the course of his long and productive life. He says things like, I cannot bear the burden of you by myself. And because of you, the Eternal was angry with me, Deuteronomy 1:37. At times, he even seems to be angry at God, accusing God of treating him unfairly after all his years of loyal service by not letting him set foot in the promised land. Is it permissible for a religious person to be angry with God? Shall we attribute Moses' outburst to frustration at all things that didn't work out in his life? Professor Viva Zornberg of Jerusalem has a different understanding of it. She suggests that Moses' complaints about God and expressions of anger at God give the Israelites permission, through his example, to express their anger at God. And they do, immediately. Complaining about conditions in the wilderness, accusing God of hating them for subjecting them to 40 years of wandering. And then, Zornberg points out, we find something in the Torah we have never seen before. You shall love the eternal God, your God, with all your heart. Deuteronomy 6:5. Before this, we've been commanded to obey God, to honor God, to follow God's ways. But never before have we been told to love God, because you can't love someone wholeheartedly with all your heart if you're afraid to be angry with him or her. You'll be censoring your emotions. There'll be a measure of pretense, of concealment, verging on dishonesty in the relationship. Being angry with someone is an inevitable dimension of caring about that person and caring about what he or she does and how she or she feels about you. I can imagine people being angry with God because all the tragedies that inflict humanity, like famine, flood, incurable illnesses like COVID, the wrong people seem to be blessed with more talent and better looks. Life is not fair, and we wonder why God doesn't do something about it. Moses' example can teach us the valuable lesson that being angry with someone does not need to fracture a relationship. Anger is a normal part of an honest relationship. We can be angry at our parents and our friends and our children. We can still love them, and we can be angry with God and still turn to God for guidance and comfort and to express our gratitude for the blessings in our lives. So, let's be open-minded, as I know we are. All right, I got a sermon coming, and then we'll do some Haftarah. Men tracht und Gott lacht. It's an old Yiddish proverb. Translated freely, it means the best way to make God laugh is to tell him your plans. Like many Yiddish proverbs, it's funny, but there's an edge to it. It recognizes that this universe that we live in is still in many ways very impenetrable. We can chart the structure of the genome, we can chart the course of the stars. We cannot come close to mapping out the future. We seem to make our plans, and as life has certainly taught us in these last few months, even if we strategize and build up structures of importance and meaning, life comes along and sort of blows a hole right in them. One of the things I like about the Yiddish proverb is its essential humility about the way the world works. Distilled in its words is the wisdom of a people used to the difficulties of life. They know that its twists and turns are unpredictable, and you shouldn't be surprised when things turn out differently than you thought that they would. There's also an essential humility about God. Nobody can read God's mind. The proverb, suggests it. Nobody really has a handle on what God's plan is. Best not to get too carried away with your own sense of importance. You're not as smart as you think you are. Eventually, the universe will prove it to you. Men tracht and Gott lacht. Man plans, God laughs. The modest spirit of the proverb is in sharp contrast with the spirit that leads religious leaders to diagnose the causes of our national tragedies. For some, unlike the rest of us, seem to think that they have a handle on what's in God's mind. And for such people, the universe is easy to decipher, as if they know that God expresses displeasure with certain natural disasters or political views, such as abortion rights and civil liberties, sending terrorists to blow up ordinary people. The theology of many fundamentalists is rooted in our very own book of Devarim, Deuteronomy, which Jews, we know, are reading all over the world this week. So there's this one verse from the week's portion, for instance, that could be a fundamentalist proof text. The people say, surely it's because God is not in our midst that these evils have befallen us. You know, Deuteronomy offers a very straightforward, deeply satisfying view of the universe. If you behave well and follow God, good things will happen to you. And if you turn away from God and sin, disaster will follow you. It's satisfying because it seems so logical. It's satisfying because it seems so just. It gives us a world that's clear and comprehensible. God is involved in history, and every event affects the divine will. It's either God rewarding the good or punishing the wicked. So the ancient Israelites interpreted the destruction of the first temple as God's response to the people's sin of idolatry. Medieval Christians interpreted the Jews' dispersion in the world as God's punishment for those who killed Jesus. 16th century Dutchmen interpreted the catastrophic floods that struck Holland as punishment for the people's greed and selfishness. And in our own day, some extreme sects of Hasidism interpret the Holocaust as God's punishment for assimilating. Look, some fundamentalist Christians view AIDS as divine vengeance upon homosexuals. It is, as I said, a straightforward and deeply satisfying, though thwarted, theology. The thwartedness is because of the biggest problem with it. It doesn't work. The world is clearly not a place where rewards and punishments are distributed justly. Good people, innocent people, sometimes suffer grievous harm, and wicked people sometimes flourish greatly. Jews recognized that early on. We did. And that's why Jewish theology doesn't end with the Torah. The Bible itself already challenges the teaching of Deuteronomy. If you look in the book of Job, for instance, Deuteronomy's theology is utterly repudiated. Job's a good man, and he suffers. His friends try to explain his suffering by traditional worldview. If bad things have happened, they tell him, you must have done something wrong. Job insists on his integrity. The text bears him out. He's an innocent man. Suffering has come upon him through no fault of his own. Never again, says the book of Job, may we interpret the universe in a simplistic fashion. Never again should we take history as a direct reflection of God's will. Never again should we presume to second guess what's on God's mind. You know, our God does not crush human beings to make a political point. Our God, at Micah, does not use airplanes and explosives as instruments of divine discipline. Our God does not give the world a pandemic, preying on the vulnerable. Why read Deuteronomy if, taken literally, it can give rise to such dangerous notions? Because of the essential power and truth that still resound from some of its words and theology. In a few months on the High Holy Days, we'll read, I have set before you this day life and death, blessing and curse. Therefore choose life, that you and your children may live. You know, Jewish theology evolves, but this truth remains central to our faith. Human beings are free to rise to exalted heights and free to descend to despicable depths. So it is that we bring blessings and curses on our world through our own acts. And so it is that these days too, we pray for the strength and the wisdom, especially now, to choose life. Shabbat Shalom. We'll conclude with a little Haftarah. Again, we find ourselves in a week where there is no connection between the Torah portion and the Haftarah, but rather this is the third of three Haftarot that are read between the seventh day of Tammuz, when the Babylonians, breached the city walls, and the ninth of Av, when they destroyed the temple. All three Haftarot deal with the punishment that will be meted out to a people that forgets God, and they are known again as the Tlat de Furanata, the three Haftarot of affliction. Here we really have trouble determining at which particular period of Isaiah's career that we find these words were spoken. In view of verses that you'll hear, it would appear that the northern kingdom, with Samaria as its capital, had already been destroyed, and that the Assyrian troops had also invaded and devastated parts of Judah, and were threatening now Jerusalem. So, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher bachar b'yamim tovim v'ratza v'divreihem hane'emarim b'emet. Baruch atah Adonai habocher b'Torah u'Moshe abdo u'Yisrael amo u'vinviei ha'emet v'tzedek. Isaiah chapter 1, verses 1 to 27. The vision of Isaiah, son of Amos, that he beheld concerning Judah and Jerusalem in the reigns of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah. Hear, O heavens, and listen, O earth, for the Eternal has spoken. I reared children and brought them up, and they rebelled against me. The ox knows its owner, and the ass its master's stall, but Israel does not know, my people does not consider. Ah, sinful nation, people weighed down by iniquity, brood of evildoers, destructive children who have forsaken the Eternal, despised the Holy One Israel, estranged themselves from God. Why invite yet more beatings, that you continue your rebellion? The whole head is sick, the whole heart is ill. From head to foot nothing is sound, injuries, bruises, fresh wounds, not dressed, nor bound, nor softened with oil. Your land is desolate, your cities burnt down. Strangers consume your land before your eyes. It is desolation, like Sodom overthrown. Only fair Zion is left. She's like a booth in a vineyard, like a hut in a cucumber field, like a city under siege. Had not the God of heaven's host left us a remnant, we should have already been like Sodom. We should have seen like Gomorrah. Hear the word of the Eternal, you rulers of Sodom. Listen to the teachings of our God, you people of Gomorrah. What are your many sacrifices to me, says the Eternal? I am sated with rams you bring as burnt offerings with the fat of your fine animals. I take no delight in the blood or bulls of lambs or goats. When you come to seek my presence, who asked this of you, to trample my courts? Bring me no more futile offerings. Incense is an abomination to me. New moon and Sabbath, the calling of assemblies. I cannot endure festivities along with evil. I hate your new moons, your festival days. You are a burden to me. I can bear them no more. When you stretch out your hands, I will avert my eyes from you. However much you pray, I will not listen while your hands are filled with blood. Wash yourselves, cleanse yourselves, put your evil doings away from my sight. Cease to do evil, learn to do good, seek justice. Relieve the oppressed, uphold the orphan's rights, take up the widow's cause. Come now, says the Eternal One, let us reason together. Though your sins be scarlet, they can become white as snow. They can be dyed crimson. They can become like fleece. If you are willing and obey, you shall eat the good things of the earth. But if you refuse and rebel, you shall be devoured by the sword, for the Eternal One has spoken. Oh, how the faithful city played the whore. Once she was so full of justice, righteousness dwelt there, and now murderers. Your silver has turned to dross. Your wine is diluted with water. Your rulers are rebels, cronies of thieves. Every one of them loves bribes and is avid for graft. They do not decide the orphan's case. The widow's cause never comes before them. Therefore, says the sovereign, the God of heaven's host, the mighty one of Israel, enough, I will rid myself of my foes and revenge myself of my enemies. Again and again I will raise my hand to you, smelt away your dross as if with lye, and rid you of your slag. And I will restore your judges in the beginning, and your counselors as in days of old. And then shall you be called righteous city, faithful town. Zion shall be redeemed by justice, and its remnant people by righteousness. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam tzur kol haolamim sadik b'chol hadorohot ha'el ha'ne'amahan ha'omer ve'oseh ha'medaber mekayim shechol devarahav emet b'tzedek al haTorah ve'al ha'avodah ve'al ha'nevim ve'al yom ha'shabbat hazeh shenatata lanu Adonai Eloheinu likdusha v'limnuka lekavod ultifaret. Al hakol Adonai Eloheinu anachnu modim lach u'mevarachim otach yitbarach shimcha b'fi kol chai tamid le'olam ba'ed baruch atah Adonai mekadesh ha'shabbat. Thank you again for joining us on another session virtually of BLT. I miss you all. Shabbat shalom.